Scotland currently has a new hate crime bill going through its parliament. It's been attacked as a massive danger to free speech, and it seems that some of the most controversial bits might make their way into the wider UK. Are the concerns right, or are campaigners getting overexcited about common sense measures? Well, let's have a look. People are talking about this because we seem poised to cross an extremely important line. Let's start with some quick context. In the modern world, we have a healthy and growing majority who think that prejudice against people on the grounds of their race, their sex, any of the other attributes they may have is despicable and wrong. You can't legislate, however, for what people think. People are allowed to hold whatever opinions they choose. Generally, that means we don't legislate for what people say. So long as they're not advocating for violence, we have free speech. Of course, if you say things that offend the norms of your society, you may have social consequences you have to bear, but that's not a matter for the law. If you commit violence against someone or call upon others to do likewise, those are already crimes because violence is criminal. You don't need to criminalise what people think, only if they act on those thoughts in a way that's criminal. Right now, that's close to where we are as far as the law's concerned, but not exactly where we are. The UK has decided that crimes that are committed and can be attributed to hateful motives against a protected group, those should be punished more severely than ones that don't. Personally, I don't quite get the logic of this. I mean, I can understand the sentiment, but if a man punches you on the nose because you said something that annoyed him or because you got red hair and he hates gingers, your nose will be exactly as broken as if he had punched you because your skin was a different colour. The punch on the nose is the crime. The damage caused is identical regardless of the motive. But you know what? It's okay. It's a legal principle I can live with. There are more important things out there to get exercised about. The courts decide how serious a sentence to give offenders. Generally, we only take an interest in that when a sentence seems seriously too harsh or seriously too lenient. At least what we're talking about is the nature of an unambiguously criminal act. But now we have the new hate crime bill in Scotland. And suddenly we're talking about what might be held to be criminal based purely on what you say. And we've had a vision recently of what this would look like. Historian David Starkey and commentator Darren Grimes were recently investigated for a YouTube interview where Starkey expressed the opinion that people who described slavery as genocide were wrong, because if it had been, according to the proper definition of a word, there wouldn't be such a thriving population of blacks as we see in the world today. Now, those weren't the words that he used, of course. He got universal criticism for using the phrase, "there wouldn't be so many damn blacks around." And that one phrase wrecked his reputation and destroyed most commercial relationships that he had. Those are those social consequences that I mentioned. But none of it was criminal, which is why it was chilling when the interviewee and the interviewer, Darren Grimes, were investigated by police. They dropped the investigation pretty quickly after an outcry, but despite that, the incident has been recorded by police as what is described as a non-crime hate incident. So no crime has been committed, but you have a mark against you. You have a police record with no due process, no defence. What are the consequences of that? Who knows? Today, maybe very little. Tomorrow? We'll come back to that later. But it's exactly why we should be looking very carefully at the Scotland bill. Much of it is uncontroversial. It brings together into one bill pre-existing measures that were split across various sources. Most of those are in line with the existing UK law I already mentioned about hate as an aggravating factor in the committing of an existing criminal act. There are still some points of concern even there. When it comes to hate as an aggravating actor, it sets a really low bar for evidence. Basically, no corroboration is required to prove that an offence was aggravated by prejudice. They have to prove the crime, but not the hate element. So if a victim of your abuse decides to claim you yelled a racially hateful epithet as you lashed out at them, you've got no defence against that part. You might think that creates a perverse incentive for all victims of crime to add that extra element if they're feeling vengeful against those that have sinned against them, which people often do. And that's the straightforward bit. Section 3 creates an offence of stirring up hatred. Now, we do have a precedent on this in UK law, although it only applies to racial hatred. It comes from Margaret Thatcher's Public Order Act 1986, which made it an offence to use language or display written materials in public, which involves threatening, abusive or insulting words or behaviour where it intends thereby to stir up racial hatred or which is likely to be stirred up thereby. However, Scotland's bill goes well beyond this by applying safeguards to a whole range of characteristics: age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, possibly sex to be decided, and by making it applicable not just in public, but, and this is the real shocker, potentially also in your own home. The UK Act specifically rules that out. It states that it is a defence for the accused to prove that he was inside a dwelling and had no reason to believe that the words or behaviour used would be heard by a person outside that or any other dwelling. But the Scottish bill would scrap that idea and potentially apply it within the family home. People have been arguing that this thereby criminalises your embarrassing uncle who comes to dinner and moans about gay weddings or whatever it may be. Many are saying that's a repulsive principle, full stop. But it's particularly a problem because some of the definitions given by the bill are just not clearly defined. If that opinionated uncle tries to convince you that gay marriage is wrong, is that to be interpreted as stirring up hatred? Now, you can have your opinion, but it's how the law interprets it that's important, and when written law is vaguely worded, then it leaves a lot of the interpretation to those in charge. The Justice Minister, Humza Yousaf, defended this clause and said the effect that could have on other family members, children in particular, is particularly insidious. Are we saying that as a society we are comfortable with no criminal sanction being applied to people because hate speech is being done within the confines of their dwelling, whereas if they stepped out into the street outside of their house, then it would be an offence? If you believe that speech should be criminalised in the first place, then that's a logical argument, which is probably one reason why you might feel that it shouldn't be. The transgender issue is obviously a particularly difficult case in this. In Scotland, under the woke guidance of the SNP, they are preparing to make gender self-defining and relatively easy to change. So if you get someone who is visibly and obviously a biological man aggressively asserting themselves, as some of the campaigners do, and then others responding equally as aggressively in that situation as people are often inclined to do when confronted with something that seems to them to be manifestly absurd, suddenly you have a legal test case that does not take you to happy places. Suddenly you may criminalise your uncle for pointing out a biological fact, which according to some has become itself akin to hate speech. And that's when you've smoothly transitioned from policing speech that's specifically about hatred to one which is about transgressing ideology. If we don't agree on the definition of what is or is not hateful, we can't put the weight of law on top of it. End of story. People have mentioned JK Rowling in relation to this bill. Nothing JK Rowling has ever said or written was expressing hatred to anyone. But according to the trans campaigners, whose position gets backed up and supported by many institutions, what she said should nevertheless be held to be hateful and transphobic. This is one reason why we don't trust this bill. The definition of what might become a crime is subject to ideological interpretation. Why would you trust the police or the politicians to decide that interpretation on the fly? When he was quizzed about this in committee, Yousaf said that his bill wasn't aiming to criminalise people who had offensive views, but he couldn't explain what, in the language of the bill, was the difference between offensive and insulting language. Insulting language is criminalised in respect to race. If the minister responsible can't give clear definitions, you're putting a lot of faith in the courts to do so. Now, there is one area where USAF has responded to criticism. The bill currently says that stirring up hatred would be criminalised even if there wasn't intent, where it is a likely consequence that hatred will be stirred up against such a group. So let's take, for example, David Starkey's comments. I would argue that his passing comment, ill-advised as he himself admits it to have been, was not likely to stir up hatred against black people. It stirred up some in relation to himself, of course. But who decides? Black Lives Matter activists would no doubt argue that any such slip would result in real harm. After all, these are the sorts of activists who would say that somebody writing a blog post makes them feel unsafe at their place of work or even in their own homes. It's absolutely their language. And this is the point. There's no solid definition of intent nor of harm, so the scope for interpretation is high. So the minister accepted this argument against the bill and specified that, yes, you had to be able to show intent. It wasn't enough simply that harm might come about. The Scottish Police Federation, representing the people who would have to enforce it, argued that the bill appears to paralyse freedom of speech in Scotland. It said that it could lead to police officers determining free speech and thereby devastate the legitimacy of the police service. They are not so keen to be the Scottish Government's thought police, it seems. The Federation's General Secretary, Callum Steele, said this: police officers are all too aware that there are individuals in society who believe that to feel insulted or offended is a police matter. The bill would move even further from policing and criminalising of deeds and acts to the potential policing of what people think or feel, as well as the criminalisation of what is said in private. The Law Society of Scotland said that it had significant reservations about the lack of clarity in the bill, quoting the significant threat to freedom of expression. The Minister Yousaf doesn't agree. He said this: I don't accept that this curtails free speech at all. Free speech in itself is never an unfettered right. We don't accept that people can go on speaking to us saying that women should be raped and children should be kidnapped. We just don't accept that freedom of speech is completely unfettered. This, of course, is the standard technique people use when arguing on such questions, bringing up the very hardest cases. You can do that and sound very justified without having to do the difficult bit of being clear where you draw the line. For some activists, people saying that children shouldn't be given hormones and life-changing surgery at a young age is every bit as bad as suggesting that they should be kidnapped. What about the children of parents living in a cult? One might make a case for kidnapping them. In that situation, it would not be hateful. It might not be wise, but it wouldn't be hateful. Whenever you get specific about drawing the line, you discover what a slippery, complicated slope it is. Which is why the people who draft parliamentary bills are well paid to put in the work and make sure the consequences are all clearly defined and unambiguous. Callum Steele again made this point, as well as saying that in the current febrile political climate, there would be a clamour for the police's reach to go much further than the original bill intended, saying this: things that are insulting could easily be redefined from insulting to abusive to meet the criminal test. And if you consider that they want to apply it to your own home as well, then all sorts of conversations could become open to action. And that sounds good to some people. Indeed, it sounds good to some people, not just in Scotland. The Law Commission, an advisory group to the UK government, has proposed that English and Welsh legislation should be moved more in line with Scotland's plans. In England and Wales, there's that dwelling defence in law, which protects conversations in the home from police intervention. Removing that defence would start the same slippery slope for the whole of the UK. And if you want to know where that takes us, just consider the case earlier this year of Harry Miller, who tweeted about transgender issues and was visited by police who said they were there to check his thinking, with the implication strongly made that he might be held to be committing a crime if he continued with his bad ways. Now that was hammered by the High Court, which ruled that the police in that case had been completely disproportionate. In a non-crime hate report, remember those, the police said that Miller's comments were designed to cause deep offence and show his hatred for the transgender community. The police have added mind reading to their range of abilities, apparently. And the judge poured scorn on that statement, pointing out there was no evidence for it, which is exactly the point. Tweeting about an issue can be interpreted by one police force as designed to cause deep offence and show hatred for a community. How long do we think it would be before ambiguously framed legislation would be being utilised according to that logic? In today's Britain, a judge can throw it out. It's worth noting that in response, the police in that case said that they noted the judge's words. They clearly weren't happy about them. The Scottish Police Federation does not want to police your thinking, but not every body of police in the UK necessarily has the same scruples. They just need the legal cover to do it. The judge in the Miller case was heroically clear on the point. The effect of the police turning up at his place of work because of his political opinions must not be underestimated. To do so would be to undervalue a cardinal democratic freedom. In this country, we have never had a Checker, a Gestapo or a Stasi. We have never lived in an Orwellian society. It's worth concluding by remembering what I said at the start, that David Starkey and Darren Grimes had the investigation against them dropped, but reportedly they have had a record made of a non-crime hate incident. The UK police guidance on such incidents was updated just last month. I think it's pretty chilling. I quote from the guidance: any non-crime incident which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on, and then a list of race, religion, sexual orientation, disability and transgenderism, where it is established that a criminal offence has not taken place, but the victim or any other person perceives that the incident was motivated wholly or partially by hostility, it should be recorded and flagged as a non-crime hate incident. So you can have a note against you on police records on the unproven, uncorroborated word of someone who feels you've been hateful towards them. You have no defence, no mechanism for appeal. Luckily, there's no way at all that system could ever go wrong. So that's a relief. It's a basic principle of law that it should be written down precisely so you know what the law is and you can avoid breaking it. In the Twitter world of woke politics, that's not how that works. You often find out what the rules are by inadvertently breaking them, because the unspoken rules changed and nobody told you, because they're unspoken, I guess. Or indeed, that the fact of you saying something is the thing that leads to the change, which is then applied retrospectively to you. Like the head teacher of the Kent boarding school, who apologised following criticism after she told her pupils that Black History Month started in 1926, when it was launched as Negro History Month. Not only is that a historically accurate piece of information, sort of thing that is meant to be passed on at schools, but the controversial word in question not long ago would have been the language used by Martin Luther King himself. Up to that point, nobody had declared it an unsayable word under any context. Now, look, language changes and evolves over time. But when did that change? Only when she said it. And some pupils, whose grasp of society and history is zero because they're children, decided it must be offensive because it sounds a bit like another word that is. And maybe because they didn't like their head teacher, I don't know. They thought it'd be a good way to make a hit against her. I mean, that's speculation, obviously, but you know, such things happen. We can then argue about whether we're going to go along with that development, because these things only mean what society agrees that they mean, regardless of their origins. I mean, if we did go along with it, I mean, it's no more or less rational than the process whereby we ended up with the other N-word becoming universally seen as unsayable under any context. I mean, look, we can accept it if society makes it a norm, although having a word that must never be uttered, it's sort of a superstition thing. But fine, if we all agree those are the rules. But if language that didn't previously mean something hateful can morph unseen into precisely that, Well, you can't have legislation that puts legal force behind a woolly definition of what's hateful and what's designed to stir up hatred. Plus, people have a right to be flawed. I mean, let's hope so. Because all of us would be judged to have flaws if all of our inner workings and private moments were subjected to critical scrutiny. People end up with prejudices against all sorts of groups. Frankly, some of the progressives of today are amongst the worst because they believe that reverse racism doesn't exist. So it's just fine and dandy to say the most despicable things so long as it's aimed at white people. When people feel that they have permission to demonize a group, the modern world finds them just as enthusiastic in that cause as humans ever were, sadly. The law has traditionally judged people on their actions, not their thoughts or even their words. There's nothing inevitable about that. If we don't want to live in an authoritarian society, you have to draw a line beyond which we won't cross. The Scottish hate crime bill logically is a pretty solid first step over that line. That's my take in any case. Agree? Disagree? Let me know what you think in the comments below.